The Case of the Poisoned Clock. Inspector Purbright. BBC Mystery Story. The morning began with the sort of quiet that only small towns know, thin, deliberate, and faintly smug. Flaxborough lay beneath a pale October sun, its tiled roofs still damp from the night's mist, its pavements smelling of coal smoke and bakery yeast. The bells of St. Christopher's chimed 9 o'clock, though one might have sworn it was nearer 8, for in Flaxborough time obeyed its own civility. In a narrow lane behind the high street stood a shop of brown glass and varnished oak, where for 50 years Mr. Henry Trowse had mended clocks. His sign, a painted hourglass, had faded to the colour of weak tea. Inside all was immaculate. A regiment of clocks lined the walls, ticking in mild disagreement with one another. Some struck, some hummed, some sighed like sleepers. But this morning, most were still. At 9:30, Mrs. Rigby from the greengrocer's arrived to fetch her kitchen clock, recently cleaned. She found the door ajar, the counter unattended. The faint, persistent ticking of one mantel clock seemed oddly loud. When she peered through the workroom door, she saw Mr. Trowse slumped at his bench, spectacles low on his nose, hand resting upon a small blue bottle. The other hand had fallen to the floor, still clutching a cloth. He looked asleep. Respectably so. By the time the constable arrived, the street had already filled with interested shoppers who pretended to be passing. Mrs. Rigby, pale with the thrill of discovery, gave her statement twice to ensure accuracy. The chemist came to confirm that the bottle, unlabelled, had once contained tincture of morphine. The inference was tidy. The old man had taken his medicine wrong. Inspector Purbright, summoned from the station by telephone, walked up the lane with the air of one approaching an inconvenient truth. He paused by the doorway, adjusted his hat, and looked inside. The body remained as found, draped in a kind of accidental dignity. Dust motes drifted through the light from the narrow window. The smell was faintly sweet, something between polish and decay. Sergeant Malley, notebook in hand, announced that the deceased had been dead some hours. "Sir, likely since midnight," Purbright nodded, examining the bench. "You've moved nothing?" "Only the chair, sir." He was leaning awkwardly. The inspector's eyes wandered over the workroom. Dozens of clocks, all arrested mid-hour, surrounded them. Only one continued to tick, a brass carriage clock on the shelf above the bench, its face bright, its minute hand advancing in small, eager jerks. Purbright drew closer. It showed 3 minutes past 9. "Curious?" he murmured. "Sir? This one keeps going." "Perhaps he'd just wound it," Malley suggested. "Perhaps." Purbright's gaze settled on the blue bottle. The cork lay nearby, slightly damp. He sniffed the rim, then replaced it without a word. He lifted the deceased's wrist and noted the skin beneath, a faint discoloration, more yellow than grey. His eyes moved again to the clock, listening to its pulse. Outside, the church bell began its 10th stroke. Purbright compared it silently with the carriage clock. The difference, 3 minutes fast, remained. He straightened, replaced his hat, and looked once more at the old man. "Kindly have the body taken to Dr. Hargreaves, and see that this clock comes too." "The clock, sir?" "Yes, it's still keeping time. I'd like to see if it continues." When Purbright stepped out into the lane, the air had turned bright and brittle. The shop door closed behind him with a small metallic click, final, precise, almost respectful. Across the street, Mrs. Rigby and 2 others pretended to examine cabbages. They fell silent as he passed. In Flaxborough, silence was never emptiness. It was simply the sound of people waiting for more to happen. Purbright, with the faintest smile, thought it almost certainly would. Rain came soft and fine over Flaxborough by afternoon, the sort that polished windows without cleaning them. Behind the wavering glass of the willow tearooms, a small congregation of the curious had assembled beneath the scent of damp coats and cinnamon. Conversation, subdued at first, began to turn like a well-oiled wheel. "Poor Mr. Trowse," murmured Mrs. Rigby, her teaspoon chiming faintly against the cup. "Such a tidy man, never once behind with the parish clock." Across the table, Mrs. Prowse, no relation, though she'd claim one if it lent interest, nodded solemnly. "Always said he'd die among his timepieces." And so he did.
"A blessing, perhaps." "Blessing or not," said another, leaning closer. "It's said there was shouting last week."
"Him and that apprentice of his, young Bryce, the thin one with the nervous eyes." The teacups paused mid-air. "You don't say?" "Oh, I do. Heard it myself near the yard gate. Words I wouldn't repeat." And 2 days later, the boy goes round the chemist for more of that cleaning spirit.
"Strong stuff by the smell." Rain drummed gently upon the awning.
The clock above the counter ticked with sudden authority, marking a silence that felt almost rehearsed. "Still," ventured Mrs. Rigby, "the inspector's taken an interest. You know how he looks, never writes much, never frowns, but you feel he's adding things up." From the street beyond the misted panes came the rhythmic click of Purbright's shoes on wet stone. He passed the window without glancing in, collar turned up, his hat gleaming with drizzle. The tea-room voices lowered automatically like candles before a priest. At the post office, Miss Teatley was sorting telegrams with funereal care when Purbright entered. The doorbell tinkled, a sound she found unduly intimate. "Morning, Inspector," she said, though it was nearer 4. "Terrible business about Mr. Trowse. We were all fond of him." "I'm sure," Purbright replied.
"He posted much, did he?"
"Once a week, regular as rent. Mostly parcels, small, well-wrapped. To London addresses, mostly medical firms. You'd think a clockmaker had little use for such things." She hesitated. "Though I did notice one marked Culpeper and Low, instruments and surgical supplies." Purbright's gaze flickered. "You recall when the last was sent?" "Last Thursday, about closing." He looked tired. "Said it was the final consignment, and after that he could rest." "Indeed." He gave a slight nod, and Miss Teatley, emboldened, leaned forward. "They say he was troubled, Inspector."
"Money gone or something worse."
"And that lady from Burkitt Street, the one who took tea there after hours." But Purbright had turned his attention to the notice board, where the clock above the counter had stopped at precisely 12. "Needs winding," he said softly. Miss Teatley coloured. "Yes, sir. It does lose heart in this damp." By the time he left, the rain had thickened to a faint veil. The smell of wet envelopes and boiled ink clung to his coat. As he walked, the faint gossip of Flaxborough moved through half-open doors and curtained parlours like draughts in an old house. Every window seemed to hum with conversation. At the corner tobacconist's, 2 men bent over the counter whispered of debts, how Trowse had lent money at quiet interest, as some do who prefer arithmetic to friendship. The chemist, polishing his bottles, declared he had sold nothing dangerous, but admitted with theatrical reluctance that the old man often mixed his own tinctures across from the station. The apprentice Bryce sat in a shelter, shoulders hunched, a cigarette unlit between trembling fingers. Purbright approached without haste, his steps steady and unalarming. "Cold evening," he said. The boy startled, then nodded. "Yes, sir. You worked long with Mr. Trowse?" 4 years. He was strict. Purbright seated himself beside him. The bus timetable above them fluttered slightly in the wind. "You argued last week?" Bryce swallowed. "Only about a customer's clock. He said I'd scratch the casing."
"I hadn't. Anyone else here?"
"The widow. She came in halfway through." Purbright nodded as if considering something faintly abstract. "You were fond of the work?"
"Yes, sir, though he—"
"He never let things go. Not clocks, not people. Said lateness was a sin." A bus rumbled by, casting its reflection across the wet pavement. When the sound had faded, Purbright spoke again, his tone mild. "You didn't happen to see anyone call at the shop last night?" "No, sir."
"Only Mrs. Trowse locking up. I'd gone home at 6. "Ah, then you're fortunate." Purbright rose, brushing raindrops from his sleeve. "Accidents can be—"
Contagious. The boy looked up sharply, but the inspector was already walking away, the sound of his heels merging with the steady hiss of rain. Back at the station, Sergeant Malley was rereading his report with the air of one trying to impress himself. He looked up as Purbright entered. "All tied up neatly, sir. Doctor says morphine poisoning. Probably mistook it for his draft." Purbright removed his hat, setting it on the radiator. "Does that strike you as likely, Malley? A man who could tell time by ear, making a muddle of his own medicine?" "Well, anyone can slip, sir." "Yes," said Purbright. "They can." He opened the paper parcel he carried. Inside, the brass carriage clock ticked with faint precision. Malley leaned closer. "Still going, sir?" "It is. Keeps its own counsel." Purbright listened a moment longer, then wound it gently. "You'll note, Sergeant, that time here moves faster than elsewhere." "How do you mean?" 3 minutes fast. "Always 3? He placed the clock on the windowsill, where the last of the daylight turned its face to pale gold. Outside, the lamps along the high street blinked into life, their reflections wavering in puddles. Somewhere, a bell chimed the hour. 9 again, impossibly. Flaxborough settled into its evening rhythm, curtains drawn, gossip safely behind glass, and time, that courteous deceiver, keeping its own delicate secrets. Purbright watched the clock tick twice more before saying, almost to himself, "In this town, even the hours have accomplices." The room fell quiet, save for that steady, incriminating beat. The following morning came pale and windless, with a kind of reticence that Flaxborough often adopted after scandal. The rain had dried to a faint silver on the pavements, and from the station steps one could smell damp brick, tea, and the faint sharpness of carbolic soap. Inspector Purbright, coat unbuttoned and hat slightly askew, stood before the small shop again. The constable on duty straightened as he approached. Inside, everything remained as it had been, the bench bare save for a line of tools and the vacant shape of a man no longer present. The brass clock still ticked, faint but steady, like an obstinate heart. He looked at it for a long moment before turning to the constable. "You've checked the storeroom?" "Twice, sir. Nothing moved." "Good. Leave it that way." He stepped outside, closing the door gently, and made his way toward Burkitt Street, where the Trowse house leaned in modest weariness between two neater dwellings. The curtains were drawn, but not enough to hide the shadow of movement inside. When he knocked, the door opened almost immediately, as though the occupant had been listening for him. Mrs. Trowse was a small woman in a greying shawl, her features finely made, but softened by long caution. She offered no invitation, only stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and clock oil. "You'll forgive the intrusion, madam," Purbright said, removing his hat. "There are 1 or 2 small matters I must confirm." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly. "Of course."
"One expects as much." He glanced about the parlour, tidy, nearly impersonal.
On the mantel stood another clock, identical in style to the one from the workshop. It too was ticking, though unevenly. "You keep it running," he observed. "My husband liked to hear it through the night." "I can't quite bear the silence." He studied her a moment longer. "Did your husband take medicines regularly?" "Every evening. Drops for his heart, and sometimes morphine when the pain was bad." "The doctor warned him it was strong." Purbright inclined his head.
"And did you measure the doses for him?"
Her eyes flickered, only once, like a match failing to light. He preferred to manage himself. "Said he trusted no one's hand but his own." "Understandable," Purbright murmured. "A craftsman's habit. Precision, even in dying." The faintest tremor crossed her lips. "He was particular." From the hallway came the subdued creak of the floorboards, and a thin young man appeared. Bryce, the apprentice. He halted when he saw Purbright, uncertainty flitting across his face. "Ah, Mr. Bryce," the inspector said lightly. "I was just admiring your late master's taste in clocks. Do you find they run differently now he's gone?" Bryce swallowed.
"I've not touched them, sir. No need to. Time manages itself." He turned back to the widow.
"If I might ask, did your husband receive visitors that last evening?" Her gaze settled somewhere near the floor. No one of note. A delivery boy, perhaps.
I retired early. Of course, he smiled faintly.
Sleep is the one appointment we all keep. When he left, she followed to the step, standing small in the grey daylight.
Inspector, she said suddenly, will there be an inquest? A brief one, routine, she nodded.
That's best. As he walked away, the door closed with the softest sigh, like a breath withheld. At the chemist's, the air smelled of peppermint and menthol. Rows of glass jars caught the morning light, turning it medicinal. Mr. Lorimer, the proprietor, greeted him with the hearty unease of a man who senses inquiry. Terrible loss, Inspector. I sold him his tinctures, of course. Always the same order: iodine, spirit of ether, morphine in small quantities. Registered, mind you. Quite, said Purbright. You recall his last purchase? Monday. He seemed weary. Spoke of finishing a large piece. Something delicate, I gathered. I did warn him to label the bottles properly. He was fussy about handwriting, Purbright smiled. A man's precision sometimes turns on him, indeed.
Poor fellow, he turned to leave, but paused by the doorway.
Tell me, Mr. Lorimer, have you ever sold oxalic acid to his apprentice? The chemist blinked. Polishing fluid? Yes, often. The boy's careless with corks, though, left one unstopped once. Eats through wood, you know. Does it? He thanked the man, then stepped back into the thin light of afternoon. The sound of church bells drifted faintly across town, 12:30 by their uncertain reckoning. Back at the station, Malley sat surrounded by paperwork, his handwriting large and careful. I've listed every statement, sir. Nothing inconsistent except the apprentice's times don't quite match the widow's. Purbright hung his coat, sat, and filled his pipe without lighting it. They seldom do, Sergeant. Time behaves differently in grief, Malley frowned.
You think someone's lying?
Purbright looked at him, eyes kind but faintly amused. No one lies in Flaxborough, Malley. They simply choose what to remember. He reached for the small brass clock on the windowsill. It ticked faintly, still 3 minutes fast. Holding it to his ear, he said softly, "Even this remembers what we prefer to forget." Malley hesitated. "Shall I take that as evidence, sir?" "Not yet." "It may simply be a witness." The sergeant blinked. "A clock, sir?" Purbright smiled.
It was present, wasn't it?
He set the clock back, straightened the papers, and listened to the steady rhythm of its ticking fill the room.
Outside, the rain began again, fine, steady, and indifferent. "Truth, Malley," he said at last, "is very like time."
Most of us keep it wound, but few ever notice when it stops. The sergeant, uncertain whether that required agreement, settled for writing it down exactly as spoken. The pen scratched softly. The clock ticked on. In Flaxborough, both sounds meant progress of a kind. By midweek, the town had found its peace again. Flaxborough was good at such recoveries. It prided itself on a quiet digestion of unpleasantness. The death of Henry Trowse, once a small tremor, had now settled into the comfortable sediment of explanation. He had, everyone agreed, been confused. An old man fiddling too long with bottles better left to chemists. The Flaxborough Chronicle sealed it in print that morning. A respected tradesman, lately in failing health, succumbed to an accidental overdose. Known for his precision, Mr. Trowse was perhaps too exacting in his own regimen. At the police station, Purbright read the article without expression, then folded it neatly and used it to steady a wobbling blotter. Seems reasonable. "Sir," said Sergeant Malley, who had been reading the same paragraph for reassurance. Doctors satisfied, coroners satisfied, widows content to let it rest. What more could there be? Purbright took his time lighting a match, shielding the flame from a draught. "There is always more, Sergeant. Whether it is useful is another matter." He drew on the pipe, eyes narrowing as he watched the smoke curl toward the window. "Have you noticed," he added, "how Flaxborough's explanations often arrive fully dressed, like visitors who've known the way all along?" Malley smiled uncertainly. "Folk like tidy endings, sir." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "So do editors." He rose, reached for his hat, and left without further comment. The Trowse house looked smaller under the grey sky, its paint dulled by drizzle. The widow received him in the parlour, dressed in dark blue rather than morning black, an omission that struck him as practical rather than cold. She offered tea. He declined. "Routine visit," he said, glancing about the room. "We must confirm a few final details for the inquest record." "Of course," she replied, folding her hands. "I do want it finished." Purbright's gaze drifted again to the mantel clock, the same one he had noticed before. Its ticking, soft but steady, filled the small silence between them. "Your husband," he began, "was said to be particular about timekeeping." "Almost to illness," she said. "He'd wait to check the hours in the dark, said clocks grew lonely when unwatched." "And yet," Purbright said quietly, "this one is now 2 minutes slow. Curious." Her eyes lifted.
"I must have wound it too little," he smiled gently.
Or perhaps too late. For a moment neither spoke. The faint hiss of rain against the windows, the muffled passing of a cartwheel outside, all folded into the stillness. Finally, she said, "I hope people will stop talking soon." "They will," he replied. "They prefer endings to continuations." He paused. "Your husband's medicines were kept here?" "In the cabinet."
"I've thrown them out." He nodded, then turned toward the door.
His tone remained mild, almost conversational. "If you find any labels or corks remaining, please keep them for me."
Even trifles have their loyalty to memory. When he had gone, she stood very still, listening to the retreating sound of his steps.
Only when the gate closed did she allow herself a long breath, thin as paper. At the Chronicle office later that day, Purbright stopped by unannounced. Mr. Weatherby, the editor, greeted him with professional cheer and ink-stained fingers. "Good of you to call, Inspector. Fine business, this sad affair." "We managed it with taste, so I read," Purbright said. "May I see the original notes from your reporter?" Weatherby blinked. "Nothing sensational, I assure you. Simple obituary work." The lad spoke to the chemist and the apprentice. The widow refused, naturally. Purbright nodded. "And the apprentice? Did he mention what time he last saw his master alive?"
6:30, I believe.
He was quite certain. "Quite," Purbright echoed. "Interesting, then, that the constable who first attended found the clocks all stopped at 8 precisely." The editor frowned.
"Is that significant?"
"Only if one finds significance in regularity." He thanked the man, took his leave, and stepped out into the narrow street. The afternoon light had the colour of tin. He walked slowly, his reflection sliding along the wet cobbles beside him. By habit more than plan, he stopped at the window of Trowse's shop. The curtains remained drawn, but through a small gap he could see the workbench, tools aligned, a faint sheen of dust beginning to settle. On the shelf, the brass carriage clock stood exactly as before, its tick faint but obstinate. He listened. The rhythm faltered for a second, then resumed with perfect composure. Later at the station, Mally was writing up inventory when Purbright returned. "Widow's been most obliging," the sergeant reported. "All bottles accounted for." The doctor confirmed the morphine bottle had his label, and the dosage matches the amount missing. Purbright nodded, absently winding the brass clock he'd brought earlier. "So an accident complete in every respect. Cause, means, and consequence all suitably domesticated." Mally looked up. "You sound doubtful, sir?" "Not doubtful, Sergeant, only disinclined toward perfection." He adjusted the clock's hands, then stopped.
"Tell me, did you alter this since yesterday?"
"No, sir."
"Haven't touched it." He set it down.
The hands read 7:10, 3 minutes slow this time. Mally frowned. "Running down, perhaps." "Perhaps," Purbright said softly. "Or perhaps time, like people, has its moods." He moved to the window. The town outside was dimming into evening, smoke curling upward from tidy chimneys. Somewhere distant, a bell marked the half-hour. Its echo reached the station a fraction too soon, or too late, to agree with any clock. Purbright listened until the sound faded. Then he spoke, not to Mally, but to the air itself. "The trouble with neat explanations," he said, "is that they rarely keep good time." He turned away from the window, his expression unreadable, and the faint ticking on the sill went on, steady, decorous, and just slightly wrong. The next morning brought a light fog that seemed to soften the edges of everything: roofs, lamplight, even memory. Flaxborough looked scrubbed and harmless again, though Purbright had long since learned to mistrust appearances so well behaved. In the station's evidence room, he stood by a small table, examining the late Mr. Trouse's belongings: a pipe, a watch chain, a set of keys, and 3 glass bottles, 2 properly stoppered, 1 without. The missing cork was no great matter, at least not to Sergeant Mally, who leaned against the doorframe with the benign patience of a man awaiting instruction. "Could have rolled off anywhere, sir," he said. "Cleaning bench, perhaps." "We'll look again." Purbright lifted the unstoppered bottle to his nose. The faint scent was wrong, not the heavy sweetness of morphine, but sharp, acrid, metallic. He tilted it toward the light. The residue inside had a faint green tint. "Oxalic acid," he murmured. "Brass polish, usually. Eats away tarnish and other things if one's careless," Mally blinked.
"That's poison, isn't it?" "Indeed. Though only fatal to those who forget its manners." He set the bottle down.
"You recall the apprentice's habit of polishing?" "The chemist mentioned it." "Yes, sir." Purbright glanced toward the fog-blurred window. "Let's visit the boy again." They found Bryce at the workshop, which now smelt of cold metal and disuse. He was packing boxes under Mrs. Trouse's supervision: tools, ledgers, unfinished repairs. The widow nodded politely to the inspector, but remained at the far end of the room, her posture exact and wordless. Purbright spoke quietly, as if to avoid disturbing the air. "Mr. Bryce, I understand you did most of the cleaning and polishing." "Yes, sir." He liked everything bright. "Said dullness spread like rot." "Quite right," Purbright said mildly.
"And this bottle, recognize it?"
Bryce took it, frowning.
"That's mine."
"For polishing brass mounts."
"I thought I'd thrown it out." "No stopper," Purbright said. "Unfortunate. Oxalic acid can be mistaken for many things in dim light." The boy's face paled. You think that's what happened?"
Purbright studied him. "I think Mr. Trouse made a number of mistakes, most of them small. It is the combination that interests me." From the far end of the room, Mrs. Trouse's voice came low but steady. "My husband never made mistakes," Purbright turned. "Then perhaps his apprentice did." Bryce looked stricken. "No, sir. I kept the bottles separate, always." Purbright's tone remained gentle. "And yet this one found its way to his bench." "I hadn't touched it since Monday." Mrs. Trouse's gaze fixed on him.
"You quarrelled that day?"
"The neighbours heard." Bryce's hands trembled. "He accused me of carelessness. Said I'd scratched a case. He wouldn't listen." Purbright watched the exchange with quiet fascination, the way one might watch clockwork unwind of its own accord. "Anger," he said softly, "is a clumsy motive, Mr. Bryce. It seldom works neatly." The boy's breath came fast.
"I didn't kill him," Purbright nodded.
"No, I doubt you did." Both of them looked at him. Even Mally's pencil paused mid-word. The inspector turned toward the workbench. The brass carriage clock still stood there, its tick diminished but steady. He adjusted his spectacles, leaning close. "Tell me," he said, "did either of you notice this clock's time when the constable came?" The widow hesitated. "It was stopped, I think." "The others were," Purbright smiled faintly.
"Ah, and now it runs again." He opened the glass front and drew the small key from its side.
"See here, someone has wound it recently." "Not the constable." "He'd not think of it." "The key still smells of polish." He turned to Mrs. Trouse. "You've been tidying." "I couldn't leave the place as it was," she said, almost pleading. "The dust, the smell, understandable." He closed the clock carefully. "And yet you've reset it to the wrong time." Her eyes flicked toward the hands, 2 minutes slow. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "None of this matters." Purbright gave her a small, courteous bow.
"Perhaps not to you, madam."
But to a man like your husband, even a minute's deviation would have been intolerable. He replaced the clock on the shelf. The tick seemed louder now, more deliberate. As they left, Mally said under his breath, "You're certain she touched it, sir?" "I'm certain she needed to," Purbright replied. "Tidiness can be a form of confession." They walked the narrow lane back toward the high street. The fog had thickened, muffling the sound of their steps. Somewhere ahead, the faint toll of the church bell drifted through.
Its echo uncertain in the damp air. "Sir," said Mally, "if it wasn't the boy—"
And the widow didn't admit. Purbright stopped beneath a gas lamp, its halo wavering in the mist. "She admitted something, Sergeant."
"Only not in words," Mally frowned. "You mean about the bottle?"
"About time," Purbright said. "People lie most easily about it. They shift it, stretch it, rearrange it to suit their comfort. But clocks, you see, clocks resist such kindness." He drew the folded newspaper from his pocket and tapped it thoughtfully.
"An accidental death. A fitting phrase."
It restores order to a disorderly event. Yet the smallest disorder remains. "The missing stopper, sir?" "Yes," Purbright said, slipping the paper away. A trifling absence. But so, in the end, was Mr. Trowse. They walked on, their figures dissolving gradually into the mist, until only the echo of their steps remained, measured, deliberate, and faintly out of time. The fog did not lift the next day. It thickened instead, moving slowly through Flaxborough like a guest reluctant to leave. Sound behaved oddly within it. Clocks chimed from invisible towers. Footsteps faded before they found their echo, and voices seemed to arrive out of order, as if the air itself were unsure of sequence. Inspector Purbright, who distrusted anything that softened outlines, stood at his office window watching the high street dissolve and reform in the mist. On his desk lay a packet from the late Mr. Trowse's solicitor, an inventory, a few unpaid bills, and a sealed letter never posted. The envelope was addressed in a slanted, careful hand, "To my dearest Alice." He opened it slowly, the paper crackling faintly like frost. "My dearest Alice, I have made a wrong that kept good time.
It beats still, though I have tried to stop it.
You will forgive me one day when you learn how the hours were spent." There was no signature, only the faint impression of a name scratched away with a fingernail. Purbright folded it again, considering the curious choice of words. A wrong that kept good time. He replaced the letter beside the receipts from Lorimer's chemists. Each page was dated neatly in pencil, yet one line caught his attention, an entry for compound solution special order, billed not to Henry Trowse, but to A. Trowse. Mally entered then, shaking the rain from his coat. "Morning, sir." Widow sent word. "She's closing the house this week. Going to her sister's in Mablethorpe." Purbright nodded without turning. "Did she settle the chemist's accounts?" "Not yet."
"Lorimer says she'll call in today." "Good." He tapped the receipts.
"There's a question worth asking about these. A recurring purchase, morphine, iodine, and something unregistered." Mally frowned. "What do you think it was?" "Perhaps regret bottled." Mally blinked. "Sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Never mind. Let's visit our friend Mr. Lorimer before Mrs. Trowse does." The chemist's shop, when they entered, was rich with the smell of linseed and glycerin. Behind the counter, Lorimer stood polishing a scale weight, as though the act itself could balance conscience. "Ah, Inspector," he said with forced brightness. "Still tying up loose ends?" "Just one or two." Purbright laid the receipts on the counter. "This compound solution, for instance." "Not standard issue." Lorimer's smile tightened. "A tonic for the lady?"
"Nervous complaints. Mr. Trowse paid cash."
"Perfectly harmless, yet curiously absent from your register." Lorimer hesitated. "Some orders I prefer to keep private. Discretion, you understand?" "The town's sensitive." Purbright's gaze remained gentle, but unyielding. "As is the law." The chemist shifted, cleared his throat.
"It was laudanum, Inspector. Diluted. She begged me not to tell the doctor."
"Said her husband disapproved of sedatives." Purbright inclined his head. "And did she take much comfort from it?" "I wouldn't know." I think you would. The man's hand, resting on the counter, twitched once, then steadied. They were an unhappy pair, he said finally. He ruled by precision. She lived by apology. There's no prescription for that. Purbright left him to his polishing. Outside, the fog pressed closer, beading on Purbright's hat brim. Mally kept pace beside him, uneasy. So if she was taking laudanum, maybe she got confused. Mixed bottles by mistake? Possible. Though I've noticed, Sergeant, that the wrong people in Flaxborough are rarely the ones confused. They turned the corner into the narrow lane where the Trow's house stood. A faint light glowed behind the curtains. Purbright paused before knocking, watching his breath mingle with the fog. Mrs. Trow's answered almost at once. She seemed paler, her composure stretched thin.
"Inspector," she said, attempting brightness. "I thought we'd finished." "Nearly." He stepped inside, hat in hand. "I came across a letter, unsent." She froze. "A letter?"
He placed it on the table. "Someone called Alice," eyes lowered. "That was me, my name before marriage." He used it when he felt sorry. Purbright waited. The clock on the mantel ticked its faint, uneven rhythm. "I hadn't seen that," she said softly. "He must have written it after I'd gone to bed." "He wrote of a wrong that kept good time," Purbright said. "Do you know what he meant?" Her hands gripped the chair back. "He said once that people mistake punctuality for goodness. He liked that, being punctual. It excused him from being kind. And the wrong?" She shook her head. "There were many. He was cruel, Inspector, but never untidy. That was his real sin." The silence lengthened. Then she added very quietly, "You think I killed him?" Purbright's reply came softly, without accusation.
"I think you stopped winding the clock." Her breath caught. "That's not the same thing." "No," he said.
"It rarely is." She turned toward the mantel, staring at the clock's thin brass face. "Do you believe evil can be polite?" "In Flaxborough," Purbright said, "it's usually punctual as well." He reached for the letter, folding it neatly. "I'll keep this for now. It may help the coroner." She did not stop him. As he left, he heard the faint sound of the clock faltering. Tick, pause, tick, as though uncertain whether to continue. Back at the station, Purbright laid the letter beside the bottle and the missing stopper. The three objects sat together like reluctant witnesses.
Mally lingered by the door. "What do we do now, sir?"
Purbright looked out at the fog again, now thinning to a pale, sickly light. "We wait. Time, Sergeant, will tell its own story. The trick is listening before it finishes." Mally nodded uncertainly.
"And if it stops?"
"Then," Purbright said, glancing toward the clock on his desk, "we'll know someone's wounded it for us." The station fell quiet. Outside, the fog lifted just enough to show the town's narrow roofs gleaming faintly in the dying light, each one keeping its secrets to the minute.
And not a second more. By late afternoon,
the fog had lifted, leaving behind a thin, washed light that made the world seem newly drawn, every brick, every bare tree etched with an almost tender precision. Yet, even in that clarity, Flaxborough remained uncertain of itself. Inspector Purbright was halfway through his tea when the telephone rang, a sound oddly shrill against the hush of the office. Sergeant Mally answered, listening for a moment before glancing up sharply.
"Sir, it's the workshop."
"The apprentice. They say he's collapsed." Purbright rose, placing his cup down with deliberate care.
"Alive?"
"Barely, sir."
"Doctor's been called." "Then let's not keep him waiting." The street outside gleamed from a recent rain.
Their footsteps struck quick, clipped notes against the pavement. At the end of the lane, the workshop door stood open, light spilling out in a sickly amber glow. A faint chemical tang drifted on the damp air, sharp, unmistakable. Inside, the air shimmered faintly above the bench, where Bryce lay slumped forward, his face grey, breathing shallow. Dr. Hargreaves knelt beside him, muttering under his breath. "Fumes," he said without looking up. "Acid fumes. He's had a good dose?" Purbright's eyes moved across the room, the open bottle, the soaked cloth, the faint mist rising from a brass plate, half cleaned. He bent, sniffed, then straightened. "Not oxalic," he murmured. Something altered, stronger, Mally pointed. Same kind of bottle, sir, from the shelf there. Same label, Purbright said softly, but not the same contents. He turned to the doctor. Will he recover? Likely, Hargreaves replied, wiping his hands. If the lungs settle, it was near enough to kill him. Purbright's expression hardly changed, but his gaze went to the small clock on the workbench. It ticked evenly, loud in the silence that followed. Remarkably resilient things, clocks, he said. They go on marking time, even when their makers stop. Mrs. Trowse appeared in the doorway then, wrapped in her dark shawl, face composed yet pale.
Is he alive?
For the moment, Purbright answered. You came quickly. I heard the shouting from next door.
I ran in. He studied her quietly.
A good instinct. Pity it wasn't quicker. She flinched, then steadied herself.
I smelled something burning.
He'd left a cloth on the bench, I thought. Purbright walked to the shelf, examining the bottles lined there. He lifted one, tilted it, then another. Have you used these recently? No, I was packing them earlier today, he nodded, setting the bottle down. Strange, then, that this one has been filled afresh. The stopper's new. The acid too pure for polishing, she said nothing. The doctor's quiet rustle as he arranged his bag filled the pause. Accidents? Purbright continued mildly. Do seem drawn to this address. Mrs. Trowse drew herself up. You think I had something to do with it?
I think someone did. He stepped closer, lowering his voice.
There's a rhythm to such events, Mrs. Trowse. They repeat, as if trying to keep perfect time with something remembered. Her eyes darkened. You speak as though vengeance could be measured in seconds. It can, he said, if one listens carefully enough. The faint tick from the workbench filled the room again, marking each word. Hargreaves rose.
He'll live, but he'll need rest.
Best not question him tonight. Quite, Purbright said. The boy has already said enough without speaking. After the doctor and widow had gone, Mally lingered, uneasy. Do you really think she meant to harm him, sir? Purbright studied the still ticking clock. I think harm in Flaxborough rarely travels far. It tends to move in circles, small, perfect ones. Mally frowned. Like the hands of a clock? Purbright smiled faintly. Precisely. He knelt to examine the bottle again. The glass was faintly fogged inside, its contents eaten into a pale residue. You see, Sergeant, there's more discipline in revenge than in murder. It demands repetition, the same tools, the same ritual, only the victim changes. Mally scratched his head. So, this was meant for the boy? Perhaps not meant at all. Perhaps simply allowed. He stood, brushing his knees. There's a difference between action and omission, though the law struggles to hear it. As they left, the light in the workshop dimmed. Purbright turned once more to look inside. The small brass clock on the bench gleamed faintly, its ticking distinct in the evening hush. For an instant, the sound seemed louder, an accusation, rhythmic and calm. Outside, the last of the mist had cleared. The sky was a faint pewter wash, the street lamps beginning to hum. Purbright paused under one, the glow outlining his breath. She's frightened, he said softly. Not of discovery, of repetition. She's realized that what she began will continue without her. Mally glanced sideways. You mean someone else? Purbright didn't answer at once. Perhaps time itself. Once you tamper with its rhythm, Sergeant, it develops a taste for correction. They walked on in silence, their footsteps matching the distant chime of St. Christopher's clock. Each strike lingered a moment too long in the air, as though unwilling to end. When they reached the station, Purbright went straight to his office. The small brass clock he'd taken from the workshop weeks before sat on the sill, ticking faintly. He wound it once, then listened. 3 minutes fast again. He smiled, though without humour. So, he murmured, you too, remember. He switched off the lamp. The faint gleam from the window caught the clock's face, its hands glinting like the blade of something patiently waiting. In the silence that followed, only one sound remained. A heartbeat that was not a heartbeat at all, steady and polite, marking the seconds of a town that had learned how to wound without haste. The road home lay in a kind of violet half-light, the last of the day smudged behind low roofs, lamps kindling one by one along the street like patient eyes reopening. Purbright walked without hurry, his coat collar turned up, his breath faint in the cooling air. There was a hush particular to that hour when daylight relinquished its duties, but night had yet to assume them. A shared pause, as if the town itself held its breath. Flaxborough, under such light, looked chastened, its prim facades gentled by shadow, its secrets tucked away behind curtains whose shapes suggested polite lives, continuing in well-rehearsed patterns. Purbright, whose curiosity was less about scandal than about symmetry, found himself watching each window as he passed. In one, a woman ironed in rhythm to the tick of her clock. In another, an old man wound his wristwatch, his hand moving as carefully as prayer. Time, Purbright thought, was this town's true religion, never questioned, always obeyed, its rituals observed in private. Yet, as he walked, he wondered whether time served them or punished them. For what else, he reflected, could wound so gently and so persistently? His shoes sounded against the damp pavement in measured steps. Somewhere distant, a train sighed. Over the viaduct, its whistle long and lonely in the cooling air. He found himself listening not to the sound itself, but to the silence that followed. A silence exact and absolute, the sort that allowed stray thoughts to be heard more clearly than one wished. He saw again, with surprising clarity, Mrs. Trouse's hand upon the mantel clock, the faint tremor in her fingers, the deliberate turn of the key. She had said she wound it to quiet the silence, but Purbright had recognized another instinct, the compulsion to control what cannot be undone. It was, he thought, a small act of rebellion against the order that had ruled her life, a defiance performed under the guise of domestic care. And yet there was something else in that movement, almost tenderness. She had wound the clock not merely to sustain time, but to keep alive something that had once governed her. Habit disguised as devotion. Love, perhaps, disguised as duty. A bicycle bell trilled faintly behind him. A boy swept past delivering evening papers. Purbright caught a glimpse of the headline as it flashed under a street lamp. Apprentice recovering after chemical mishap. The town would be grateful for such. Phrasing, another tidy accident, another acceptable explanation. Flaxborough preferred its tragedies brief and unexamined, trimmed neatly to fit its moral furniture. He crossed the square where the statue of some forgotten benefactor stood, half submerged in mist, rising from the cobbles. The lamps reflected, dimly in puddles, doubling the town's lights like memory repeating itself. At the far end, the church clock struck 8. Purbright checked his watch. 5 past. He smiled, not from amusement, but recognition. Even St. Christopher's had fallen behind. Contagious, he murmured, and continued on. Passing the haberdashers, he paused. The display window, though dark, reflected his own face beside a row of pocket watches arranged in a velvet line. Their faces caught what light remained. Each ticked faintly, out of step with the others. He thought of Henry Trouse, surrounded by such order, striving to impose perfection on instruments that resisted it by nature. Every clock, after all, drifted eventually. Perhaps that was what had maddened the man, an invisible disobedience he could neither repair nor forgive. Purbright resumed walking, his thoughts unfolding with the rhythm of his steps. Time, he considered, was less a measure than a temperament. Some people hoarded it, others spent it carelessly. For a few, like Mrs. Trowse, it became both prison and companion. And for her husband, perhaps, an adversary to be mastered, even unto death. As he reached the turning for his street, the evening deepened into a fine dusk blue. The first stars trembled above the chimneys. Somewhere close, a door opened, spilling laughter briefly into the street before closing it again. A dog barked twice, then thought better of it. Purbright stopped at the corner, looking back toward the workshop lane. He could not see it from here, but he could almost hear the faint, rhythmic ticking from within, the brass carriage clock still keeping its strange, insistent beat. He had brought one version of it to the station, yet it seemed to him that every house in Flaxborough now echoed with its sound, each second repeating the same soft accusation. He drew out his watch. The hands glimmered faintly in the lamplight. 3 minutes fast. He smiled again, this time with something close to weariness. "You too," he murmured. A curtain moved in an upper window across the street. The faint silhouette of a woman passed, her shadow slow and deliberate. Purbright wondered, not for the first time, how many such figures lived within their orderly rooms, their hearts beating in time with some private regret. He had learned long ago that guilt, like time, required only maintenance. It did not fade, it merely kept going, quietly and without complaint. He reached his own gate, paused, then looked up at the window of his sitting room where a lamp glowed softly. There was comfort in that small, constant light, the kind of order he could endure. He unlocked the door, hung his hat upon its peg, and stood, listening to the silence of his house. It was a different sort of silence, clean, uninhabited, without deceit. On his desk, the small brass clock from the Trowse workshop waited. He had left it unwound, certain it would stop by now. But as he crossed the room, he heard it, a faint, stubborn ticking, measured and unerring. He stood over it for a long while, the sound steady beneath the hum of the lamp. Then, very gently, he turned the key once, feeling the spring catch. "There," he said quietly. For accuracy's sake, outside, a distant bell struck 9. The clock answered half a second sooner. Purbright listened to both until they blurred together, their difference slight but undeniable, the small human imperfection that separates order from truth. Then, as the last echo faded, he turned out the light. In the brief darkness that followed, only the clock remained, alive, implacable, and faintly reproachful, keeping its own counsel in the quiet heart of Flaxborough. The next morning was bright but brittle, a hard winter light that flattened colour and sharpened edges. The station, washed in that pallid sun, felt almost reverent, its corridors quiet, the faint hiss of the kettle, the only sound to prove time was moving at all. Inspector Purbright had asked Mrs. Trowse to call. Nothing official had been said, merely a word sent through the constable at her gate. "If you could spare a few minutes, madam, the inspector would be obliged." When she entered, she looked smaller than he remembered. The black shawl seemed too heavy for her shoulders. In her gloved hands, she held no handbag, no defence, only a folded handkerchief, neatly ironed. Purbright, standing by the window, turned and smiled with his usual courtesy. "Mrs. Trowse, thank you for coming. Do sit down." She obeyed without speaking. The chair gave a faint sigh beneath her weight. Purbright moved to the small side table where the tea tray waited, the milk already clouding in its jug. He poured 2 cups, his movements unhurried, almost domestic. "Milk, no sugar?" "As you please," she said. He placed the cup before her and took his own, sitting opposite. For a moment, the silence between them felt companionable, two people resting briefly from the strain of living among others. Then he said, almost gently, "You must forgive me if this feels unnecessary. It may well be so, but there are threads still untidy, and I dislike untidiness." Her eyes lifted. "You think I killed him?" "I think," Purbright said, "that you've carried something heavy for some time, and it may not belong entirely to you." She looked down at her hands. "You mean guilt? That's one word for it." Her fingers tightened around the handkerchief. "You made guilt a kind of clockwork. Every day wound by reproach, every hour measured by what I failed to be. You can't imagine it, the endless correction, the small cruelties hidden in courtesy." He didn't strike, Inspector. He didn't even shout. He just kept time, perfectly. Her voice, though soft, had the terrible steadiness of truth long rehearsed. Purbright listened, eyes half closed, as though the rhythm of her speech matched something he already understood. "When he fell ill," she went on, "I thought he would stop. He didn't. He counted his heartbeats instead." She gave a short laugh. Even dying, he couldn't let the clock run free. The kettle clicked behind them. A faint wisp of steam rose and faded. "You spoke of mercy," Purbright said quietly. She nodded once. "I didn't poison him, Inspector. I only let time do its work. He'd mixed his medicines wrong before. I stopped correcting him. That's all. I let him believe himself infallible, and the clock." Her eyes moved to the mantel where his own carriage clock ticked, precise as a metronome. "He hated silence. I wound it for him even after he was gone. It was the only sound that forgave him." Purbright regarded her for a long moment. "You could have told me sooner. I wasn't sure it mattered." "It may not," he admitted. "But the truth, like a clock, dislikes being ignored. It ticks louder the longer you try." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Then I suppose I'm finished winding it." He set his cup down. The porcelain clicked faintly. "Mrs. Trowse, what you describe is not murder. The law calls it omission, and it seldom convicts kindness." She looked at him sharply, as though uncertain whether to thank or condemn him. "Kindness," she said. "Is that what you call it?" "I call it proportion. Some deaths require less punishment than the lives that preceded them." The room settled into quiet again. Outside, a bell rang from the church tower, 10 strokes, bright and punctual. Purbright waited until the final note died, then rose and crossed to the window. Below, the town was moving through its ordinary motions. Shop shutters lifted, bicycles rolled from sheds, dogs barked with the optimism of creatures unaware of moral complexity. It was all so ordinary that it hurt to look at. Without turning, he said, "There will be an inquest, of course. Routine, nothing unpleasant." "You'll not be accused of anything, Mrs. Trowse, but people will talk, as they must." "Try not to listen too closely. I've lived with talk all my life," she said. "It's only the silence afterward that frightens me." Purbright nodded almost to himself. "Then perhaps you might find use in that clock again. Wind it when you need company. Let it remind you that even silence has a rhythm." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Is that permission, Inspector?" "It's advice," he said gently. "The law's too clumsy for permission." As she reached the door, he added, "One last thing. Why did you alter the boy's cleaning fluid?" She turned, startled. "I didn't, no." "No, but I knew someone would." He was proud, like my husband, proud enough to think he understood danger. The same pride repeating itself, you see? Time does that too. It repeats what we refuse to mend. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them felt charged, fragile as a balance poised on its final grain of sand. Then she said softly, "You won't find proof." "There isn't any." Purbright inclined his head. "That's rather the point." She left without another word. The door closed gently behind her, leaving the faint scent of rain-damp wool and lavender. Purbright remained seated, staring at the empty chair opposite. The cup she had used still trembled slightly on its saucer. He reached out, steadying it with one finger, then looked toward the clock on the mantel.
It ticked evenly, implacable, each second as calm as the last. He listened to it for a long time, until its rhythm began to merge with the faint throb of his own pulse.
Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and spoke into the stillness, his voice almost kind. Poisoned clocks, poisoned hours. Perhaps they're the same thing after all. The clock gave no answer, only went on keeping its perfect, indifferent time. The inquest took less than half an hour. The coroner, a gentleman of practiced composure, read his findings with a voice that managed both sympathy and efficiency. The verdict, accidental poisoning, was received with murmurs of assent. The widow wept discreetly, a handkerchief pressed to her cheek. The apprentice, pale but upright, stared fixedly at the floor. No questions were asked that had not already been answered elsewhere. No silences were disturbed. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sunlight had a hesitant warmth, as if uncertain it should intrude upon so polite a resolution. The crowd, small and well-behaved, dispersed in pairs. A few expressed satisfaction that things had ended properly, though no one could quite define what that meant. The Flaxborough Chronicle reporter, having filled 2 pages of shorthand in anticipation of something quotable, found only one usable line, Dr. Hargreaves's comment that morphine is a treacherous servant, but an obedient master. It would do. Inspector Purbright lingered by the steps, his hat tilted against the glare. He looked neither pleased nor dissatisfied, merely thoughtful in the way of a man watching the world resume its usual tricks of self-deception. Sergeant Malley, beside him, adjusted his notebook. "All tidy, sir," he said, not quite sure whether it was a conclusion or a question. "Tidiness," Purbright murmured, "is often mistaken for truth." "Still," said Malley. "Better than a scandal." "Yes," Purbright said, "the town prefers its sins embalmed."
Not dissected. They parted there, Malley heading toward the station.
Purbright taking the longer way round through the market square. The stalls were closing. The air held the scent of apples and damp canvas. Somewhere a clock struck 3, a fraction late, its echo trailing across the cobbles. He paused, listening, then smiled faintly, as though the sound confirmed something he'd already suspected. He passed the chemist's shop. The window blinds were half drawn, but he could see Mr. Lorimer within, polishing the same counter with exaggerated care. Their eyes met briefly. The chemist offered a small, nervous nod. Purbright returned it, but did not enter. Further along, near the station yard, a cart waited with 2 modest trunks. Bryce stood beside it, his hands in his pockets, his cap pulled low. The driver smoked, indifferent to the world. Purbright stopped. "Leaving us already, Mr. Bryce?" The boy startled, then straightened. "Yes, sir. Thought it best." "There's work in Lincoln, watch repair." "Good. Change of air." Bryce hesitated.
"I didn't poison him."
"You know that, don't you?" Purbright studied the pale, uncertain face. "I know you didn't mean to."
"That's usually enough to satisfy the living." The boy nodded, though his eyes showed no comfort.
He climbed onto the cart, and the driver flicked the reins. The horse moved forward with a weary clop of hooves. Purbright watched until the sound faded into the murmur of the town. Back at the station, the office smelled of stale tobacco and damp paper. The afternoon light, filtered through dusty blinds, fell across his desk in stripes. A single sheet lay before him, the report for the file. It was spare to the point of austerity. Henry Trowse, clockmaker, deceased. Cause of death, morphine poisoning, accidental. Secondary incident involving apprentice, exposure to toxic vapor, recovered. No criminal intent established. Case closed. He read it once more, then signed his name with careful precision. When the ink dried, he folded it neatly and slipped it into the file marked Trowse, H. For a moment he sat motionless, gazing at the closed folder as if expecting it to breathe. Then he opened the drawer and took out the small brass stopper, the one recovered from beneath the workbench weeks ago. Its surface caught the afternoon light, dull but enduring. He turned it between his fingers, feeling its weight. It was nothing really, a scrap of metal without consequence. Yet it had once belonged to a bottle, and that bottle had stood beside a man who believed in perfection. Purbright wondered if it mattered which came first, the flaw in the stopper or the flaw in the man. Perhaps neither. Perhaps both were simply inevitable. He set it on the desk, just to the right of the clock that had once ticked in Trouse's shop. The clock's face gleamed faintly, its hands aligned with unsentimental precision. 3 minutes fast, as always. Mally knocked and entered carrying a sheaf of papers. "Post, sir." "Routine stuff." "Leave it there," said Purbright. The sergeant hesitated, glancing at the clock. "You ever think, sir, that some things are meant to be wrong?" Purbright looked up, surprised.
You mean like what?
Mally shrugged. "That clock, for one. You could fix it easy enough, but you don't." Purbright smiled faintly. "If I corrected it, Sergeant, I'd have nothing left to think about." Mally grinned awkwardly and withdrew, closing the door. The room settled again into its familiar quiet. Outside, the day was fading. The pale light on the floor warmed briefly, then began to recede. Purbright leaned back, pipe unlit, listening to the rhythm of the clock. It no longer sounded accusatory, merely persistent. Like breath, he reached for the small stopper again, placing it upright on the edge of a blotter. "For balance," he said softly. Somewhere in the town, another bell struck the hour. The tones arrived unevenly, echoing through the late air, as though Flaxborough itself were undecided which moment it occupied. Purbright smiled. He picked up his pen, noted the time, accurate or not, and closed the ledger with a soft thud. The brass clock ticked on, untroubled by verdicts, content to continue its polite deception. In the gathering quiet, it seemed almost benevolent, keeping time for no one in particular. Purbright stood, replaced his hat, and paused a moment at the door. His eyes returned to the desk, the clock, the stopper, the file. A small arrangement of facts and silences, each balanced neatly upon the other. "Good enough," he said. He turned out the light. In the dark, the clock kept ticking, steady, calm, and 3 minutes fast, as if Flaxborough itself had chosen at last to live slightly ahead of the truth. Morning returned to Flaxborough with the kind of mild indifference that belongs only to English towns too old to startle and too polite to mourn. The bells of St. Christopher's rang 8, precise enough to reassure the living, but never quite right enough to trouble them. A thin fog drifted across the square, blurring the edges of shop fronts, softening the stone into a kind of memory. The workshop on Burkitt Lane bore a new sign now. The paint was still bright, the lettering neat. W. Priddle, Horologist and Repairs. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, brass, and quiet hope. The newcomer moved carefully among the tools and clocks, unaware that the floorboards had once been scrubbed clean of a more delicate confusion. He hummed as he worked, a tune without conviction, winding each clock as though giving breath to harmless creatures. Outside, the passers-by glanced in politely, but did not linger. They preferred not to be reminded of the late Mr. Trouse, whose death, being accidental, had long ceased to be tragic and settled instead into anecdote. The widow was seen occasionally in the grocer's, dressed with new restraint, her hands bare of rings. She nodded to those who greeted her, though her smile remained practiced, like handwriting one never quite forgets. Inspector Purbright passed that way often, but never stopped. He would slow his stride just enough to catch the faint, uneven ticking from within the shop, then continue on, his expression composed. To Mally, walking beside him one morning, it seemed almost reverent, the way the inspector tilted his head, listening. "Strange business, that," Mally said after a while.
Still feels
"Unfinished somehow." Purbright smiled faintly. Unfinished things often do, Sergeant.
It's their chief attraction, Mally nodded, though his brow furrowed.
New fellows got courage taking that place on. Courage or ignorance. They sometimes sound alike. They turned into the high street, where the baker's shutters were half up, and the air smelled faintly of yeast and coal smoke. The town was alive again in its quiet, habitual way. A lorry trundled past with a complaint of gears. A milk cart rattled over cobbles slick with mist. The rhythm of life had reasserted itself, polite and punctual, as though nothing in Flaxborough had ever been out of order. Yet Purbright felt it still, the faint pulse of something unresolved, like a metronome hidden behind a wall. Not guilt, precisely. More the sense that truth, having once been set in motion, continued of its own accord long after people ceased to notice. At the corner, the church bell began its quarter-hour chime. Purbright drew out his pocket watch, glanced at it and, almost unconsciously, turned the crown 3 clicks forward.
Mally noticed 3 minutes fast again, sir?
Consistency, Purbright said mildly, is underrated. They crossed the square in silence. On the green, children were playing marbles, their laughter bright against the damp air. From the post office came the thump of letters and Miss Teatley's brisk voice correcting a misaddressed parcel. The ordinary, that old magician, was performing again with admirable confidence. Back at the station, Purbright removed his hat and coat, setting them precisely on their peg. The small brass stopper still occupied its place on his desk, catching a sliver of sunlight. He regarded it for a moment before settling into his chair. Mally brought in the morning's post, a stack of reports, requisitions, and one thin envelope marked private. Purbright opened it last. Inside was a note, unsigned, written in an unfamiliar, rounded hand. "Thank you for saying nothing. The silence has been kind. No address, no clue. The handwriting could have belonged to anyone or to no one." He folded it carefully, placed it beneath the stopper, and did not speak of it again. The day unfolded without incident. A missing bicycle, a lost cat, a minor dispute about hedge boundaries, Flaxborough's small gears turning once more in their patient rhythm. Outside, the sun broke through for a time, warming the rooftops and glinting on the church weathercock, which had pointed east for so long that no one remembered if it ever turned. Late in the afternoon, Purbright walked out again, following no particular route. The new clockmaker was standing in his doorway, a polishing cloth over his arm, nodding cheerfully to those who passed. The sound of ticking reached the pavement, an overlapping chorus of minutes and hours, each slightly at odds with the next. "Morning, Inspector," the man called. "Fine day for setting things right, eh?" Purbright paused, half smiling. If only it were that simple. "Clocks don't lie, at least," said the man, misunderstanding him entirely. "No," Purbright said. "They just tell the truth too often." He walked on, his footsteps blending with the hum of the town. At the far end of the high street, the river lay still and pale beneath the bridge. Purbright leaned on the railing, watching the slow drift of leaves across the surface. The reflection of the church tower trembled slightly with the movement of the water, as though time itself were hesitating before continuing downstream. He drew out his watch once more. The second hand moved in its precise circle, obedient but faintly smug. He adjusted it again, 3 minutes forward, and closed the lid. Behind him, the bell of St. Christopher's began to strike the hour. The sound carried clearly over the rooftops, rolling through the fog and fading toward the fields beyond. It was neither fast nor slow, simply confident, as if it had never been otherwise. Purbright listened until the last note dissolved, and smiled to himself. "Close enough," he said softly. He turned for home, the evening mist rising again behind him. In the windows he passed, lamps were being lit, each small circle of light another clock face against the coming dark. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and bread, of endings disguised as routine. And as he reached the corner where the lane curved out of sight, the faintest sound followed him. A distant, rhythmic ticking, steady as breath, marking time in the quiet heart of Flaxborough, where truth, like time, never stopped entirely, but simply kept its own imperfect pace. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.